The blazing sun hung like a molten coin in the endless blue sky as Harriet Zimmerman collapsed onto the scorched earth, her parched lips cracking and her vision blurring. 3 days in the merciless Nevada desert had stripped away her strength, her hope, and nearly her life. She had long since stopped calling for help, her voice reduced to a raspy whisper that the unforgiving wind carried away into nothingness. Xavier Ingram spotted the crumpled form from a quarter-mile away, the unusual shape breaking the monotonous landscape of sand and scrub brush. He'd been tracking a stray from his herd when the glint of something metallic caught his eye. Spurring his chestnut mare forward, he approached cautiously, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip, a necessary precaution in these lawless territories of 1876. As he drew closer, the form took shape, not the prone carcass of a desert creature, but a woman. Her once fine traveling dress was torn and filthy, her auburn hair matted with dust and sweat. For a moment, Xavier feared he'd come upon yet another victim claimed by the unforgiving wilderness. But then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest. "Madam," he called, dismounting swiftly. "Madam, can you hear me?" Harriet's eyes fluttered open, though the effort seemed almost too much. A mirage, she thought. Another cruel trick of the desert. She'd seen so many these past 3 days, shimmering pools of water that vanished upon approach, phantom riders that dissolved into heat waves. Yet this illusion knelt beside her, casting a blessed shadow across her sunburnt face. "Water," she managed to rasp, the word hardly more than an exhale. Xavier didn't hesitate. He uncorked his canteen, his last water, meant to sustain him on the ride back to his ranch, and gently lifted her head. "Slow now," he cautioned as he tipped the precious liquid to her cracked lips. "Just a little at first." The water felt like salvation itself as it trickled down Harriet's parched throat. She wanted desperately to gulp it all, but Xavier pulled the canteen away after a few sips. "More," she pleaded, reaching weakly. "In a minute," he promised. "Too much at once will make you sick." As he allowed her small, measured sips, Xavier assessed her condition. Her skin was badly sunburnt, her lips cracked and bleeding. Dehydration had left her disoriented, but she was alive barely. "I'm Xavier Ingram," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles northeast of here. Can you tell me your name, madam?" "Harriet," she whispered. "Harriet Zimmerman. Miss Zimmerman, I need to get you out of this sun. Can you ride?" She tried to sit up but couldn't summon the strength. Her head lolled against his arm, consciousness slipping away again. Xavier made a swift decision. After giving her the last of his water, he lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, cradling her limp form against his chest. She felt impossibly light, as though the desert had stolen not just her strength but her very substance. "Hold on, Miss Zimmerman," he murmured, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I've got you now." As they set off toward the Ingram ranch, Xavier couldn't help but wonder what twist of fate had brought this woman to such dire straits. The nearest town, Silver Creek, was almost 30 miles away, and the stage route didn't come within 10 miles of where he'd found her. Whatever her story, it would have to wait. Right now, his only concern was keeping her alive. The journey back seemed interminable. Xavier kept one arm securely around Harriet's waist as she drifted in and out of consciousness against him. The sun beat down relentlessly, and he found himself wishing he hadn't given away all his water, though he knew he couldn't have done otherwise. His own throat was parched, his lips beginning to crack, but the woman in his arms had clearly been without water far longer. Finally, the silhouette of the Ingram ranch appeared on the horizon, a modest main house, bunkhouse, and barn nestled against the base of a small mountain range. A spring-fed creek ran behind the property, the reason Xavier's father had claimed this land 20 years earlier. Right now, That water source seemed more valuable than all the gold in California. As they approached, Xavier saw his foreman, Samuel Porter, emerge from the barn. "Sam," he called, his voice hoarse. "Need help here?" The older man came running, his weathered face creasing with concern as he took in the scene. "Found her out in the flats," Xavier explained as he carefully dismounted, still supporting Harriet. 3 days in the desert from the looks of it." "Good Lord," Samuel muttered, helping Xavier lift the unconscious woman down from the horse. "I'll fetch Mrs. Holloway." Xavier nodded gratefully. Beatrice Holloway, the ranch cook and housekeeper, had been with the family since Xavier was a boy. She had a knowledge of healing herbs and remedies that had saved many a cowhand over the years. He carried Harriet into the house, her head lolling against his shoulder. Despite her dire condition, he couldn't help noticing the delicate curve of her jaw, the sweep of her lashes against her sunburnt cheeks. Even ravaged by the desert, there was something about her that stirred his interest beyond mere concern. Mrs. Holloway burst into the front room, her gray hair escaping its usual tidy bun. "Put her in the spare bedroom," she commanded, already rolling up her sleeves. "And fetch water cool, not cold. We need to bring her temperature down gradual-like." Xavier did as instructed, laying Harriet gently on the bed in the small room off the main hall. Mrs. Holloway shooed him out while she tended to the young woman, but not before he'd glimpsed the housekeeper, cutting away the tattered remains of Harriet's once fine dress. "She's in bad shape, Mr. Ingram," Mrs. Holloway said when she emerged an hour later. "Severely dehydrated, sunburned something terrible, and her feet." She shook her head. "Blisters burst and gone to raw flesh in places. She must have walked for miles. Will she make it?" Xavier asked, the question blunter than he'd intended. "If she makes it through the night, she'll have a fighting chance. I've got some willow bark tea steeping for the pain and fever, and I've dressed those feet best I can. But she needs water more than anything. Can you sit with her? Get her to sip whenever she wakes, even if just for a moment." Xavier nodded and took up position in the chair beside the bed. Harriet lay still beneath the light sheet Mrs. Holloway had drawn over her. Her face, cleaned of dust, showed both the damage done by her ordeal and the fine features beneath. She couldn't be more than 25, he thought. For hours, he maintained his vigil, occasionally managing to get a spoonful of water between her lips when she stirred. As night fell, her fever rose and she began to mumble deliriously, "The carriage, have to find." Her voice trailed off, her head turning restlessly on the pillow. "SHH," Xavier soothed, bathing her forehead with a cool cloth. "You're safe now. They'll be looking. Telegram." More disconnected phrases, offering tantalizing glimpses into how she'd come to be alone in the desert. Near midnight, her fever broke, and she fell into what seemed a more natural sleep. Xavier, exhausted himself, finally allowed Samuel to take over the watch while he caught a few hours' rest. Dawn was breaking when Mrs. Holloway shook him awake. "She's asking for you," the housekeeper said. "Seems more lucid now." Xavier splashed water on his face and hurried to the sickroom. Harriet was propped up slightly against the pillows, her eyes a striking hazel. He now saw clear and focused for the first time. "Mr. Ingram," she said, her voice still weak but steadier than before. "Mrs. Holloway told me you saved my life." Xavier shook his head modestly. "Found you is all. Mrs. Holloway did the real doctoring. You gave me your last water," Harriet insisted, "and carried me all this way. I owe you everything." Her directness caught him off guard. Most ladies of his acquaintance, admittedly few, would have hidden behind delicate manners and indirect expressions of gratitude. Anyone would have done the same, he said, uncomfortable with her intensity. "No," she replied with surprising firmness. "Not everyone would." After a moment she added, I need to send word to my uncle in Sacramento. He'll be frantic by now." "Of course," Xavier agreed. "But that can wait until you're stronger. Silver Creek's telegraph office is a fair ride from here." "How long," she asked, frowning, "before you can travel, Mrs. Holloway would know better, but those feet of yours will need time." "No," she interrupted. "How long until a telegram can be sent?" Xavier studied her curiously. Most people in her condition would be thinking of their own recovery, not pushing to communicate so urgently. "I could ride into town tomorrow if it's that important." Relief softened her features. "Thank you. I can't bear the thought of him worrying." Her hands twisted the sheet anxiously. "The stage was attacked 3 days ago, about 20 miles from here, I think. Bandits. They took everything of value and ran off the horses. The driver and shotgun messenger were killed. I was the only passenger." Xavier's jaw tightened. Stage robberies weren't uncommon, but outright murder of the drivers was a new level of brutality. "You walked away from the attack?" She nodded, wincing as though the memory itself caused physical pain. "I thought I could reach the next station. I had no idea how far it was. After the first day, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake, but by then I was lost. Everything looks the same out there." Her voice trailed off and she closed her eyes briefly. "If you hadn't found me when you did." "But I did," Xavier said firmly, not wanting her to dwell on how close she'd come to death. "And you're safe now." Her eyes opened, fixing him with that direct gaze again. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "I believe I am." Something passed between them in that moment, a connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Xavier felt an unexpected urge to protect this woman, to ensure nothing threatened her again. It was more than the natural concern for someone he'd rescued. It was something specific to her, to the courage and clarity she showed even in her weakened state. "You should rest," he said, breaking the moment. "I'll have Mrs. Holloway bring you some broth." Harriet nodded, clearly exhausted by even this brief conversation. As Xavier turned to leave, she spoke again. "Mr. Ingram, what is it that you do here?" The question, so ordinary and yet so unexpected in the circumstances, made him smile. "I raise cattle, Miss Zimmerman." "Not very exciting, I'm afraid." "On the contrary," she murmured, her eyes already closing. "I think you lead quite an extraordinary life." Xavier left the room with her words echoing in his mind. He'd never considered his existence remarkable in any way. He ran the ranch his father had established, managed the small crew of hands who worked for him, drove cattle to market twice a year. It was honest work, but hardly the stuff of adventure stories. Yet this woman, who had survived a deadly attack and days alone in one of the harshest environments on Earth, thought his life extraordinary. The notion stayed with him as he went about his chores that day, checking fences in the north pasture, overseeing the breaking of a new horse, reviewing the accounts with Samuel. That evening, when he returned to check on their guest, Mrs. Holloway met him at the door with a concerned expression. "She's been asking about leaving again," the housekeeper reported. "Says she needs to get to Sacramento as soon as possible. I told her she's in no condition to travel, but she's determined." Xavier frowned. "I'll talk to her." He found Harriet sitting up in bed, a tray with barely touched food on the side table. Her color was better, but the dark circles under her eyes spoke of her continued weakness. "Mrs. Holloway tells me you're planning a journey," he said without preamble. Harriet lifted her chin slightly. "I need to reach Sacramento. My uncle is expecting me, and after the stage robbery, he'll assume the worst. Which is why I'm riding to Silver Creek tomorrow to send that telegram for you," Xavier reminded her. "There's no need for you to travel until you're recovered." "You don't understand," she insisted. "It's not just about letting him know I'm alive. I was carrying important papers that could affect the outcome of a legal dispute over my family's property. The bandits took them along with everything else. Xavier pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down, sensing this conversation might take some time. "Tell me about these papers." Harriet hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "My father owned a substantial parcel of land outside Sacramento farmland, mostly, but valuable because of its location near the river. When he died last year, he left everything to me. My uncle has been managing the property while I finished my schooling in San Francisco." She paused, and Xavier nodded encouragingly. "3 months ago, a man named Victor Palmer appeared, claiming my father had sold him the land shortly before his death. He produced a bill of sale that appeared to have my father's signature, but my uncle was certain it was forged. My father would never have sold that land. It had been in our family for 2 generations. "And the papers you were carrying," Xavier prompted, "evidence proving the forgery." "A handwriting expert's analysis, plus letters from my father dated after the supposed sale, discussing future plans for the property. Without them, it's my word against Palmer's forged document, and his connections in Sacramento are substantial." Xavier understood her urgency now. Land disputes in the rapidly developing West could turn ugly fast, especially when valuable property was at stake. "When is this case being decided?" "The judge is hearing arguments in 2 weeks, Harriet said, her expression growing more distressed. "If I don't appear with those documents, Palmer will almost certainly be awarded the land." Xavier rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. The bandits probably didn't realize what they had. They were likely after cash and valuables, not legal papers. "Which means they might have discarded them," Harriet concluded, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "It's possible," Xavier agreed, though he didn't want to raise false expectations. "I'll ask around when I'm in town tomorrow. If there's been a stage robbery, people will be talking." "Thank you," Harriet said, reaching impulsively for his hand. Her fingers were cool against his sun-warmed skin. "I know I'm imposing terribly, and you've already done so much." "You're not imposing," Xavier assured her, surprised by how much he meant it. In truth, her presence had brought an unexpected energy to the ranch house. "Just focus on getting your strength back. We'll figure out the rest." Her fingers tightened briefly around his before she withdrew her hand. "I've never been very good at sitting still when there's a problem to solve." "Somehow that doesn't surprise me," Xavier said, a smile tugging at his lips. "But sometimes healing is the work that needs doing first." Harriet regarded him curiously. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Ingram." "Oh, and what did you expect from a rancher who found you half dead in the desert?" Her lips curved slightly. "Someone less thoughtful, perhaps." Xavier wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and stood up. "Get some rest, Miss Zimmerman. I'll leave at first light for Silver Creek." As he headed to the door, Harriet called after him. "Mr. Ingram, in your telegram to my uncle, please don't mention the stolen documents. I don't want to worry him more than necessary." Xavier nodded his agreement, though he wondered at her request. It seemed odd not to inform her uncle about such an important development. But it wasn't his place to question her decisions. The next morning, Xavier set out for Silver Creek, just as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern mountains. The small town served as the commercial hub for ranchers and miners scattered across the region, offering basic necessities like a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and the all-important telegraph office. The ride took just over 3 hours at a steady pace. As Xavier approached the town, he noted more activity than usual: extra horses hitched outside the saloon, a cluster of men in front of the sheriff's office. News of the stage robbery had clearly reached Silver Creek. He headed straight for the telegraph office, a small building next to the general store. Inside, the operator, a thin man named Ellis, looked up from his equipment. "Morning, Xavier. What brings you to town?" "Need to send a telegram to Sacramento," Xavier replied, pulling out the paper where he'd written down the message Harriet had dictated. "And I'm looking for information about the stage robbery that happened a few days back." Ellis's eyebrows shot up. "You heard about that, did you? Nasty business. Driver and guard both shot dead, passenger missing and presumed the same. Sheriff's got a posse out looking, but no sign yet of the gang responsible." "The passenger isn't dead," Xavier said. "She's at my ranch, recovering. I found her wandering in the desert 3 days after the robbery." Ellis's mouth fell open. "Well, that's a miracle if I ever heard one. Sheriff Adams will want to talk to her for sure." "She's not well enough for questioning yet," Xavier said firmly, "but I'll let him know she's safe when she's stronger." Ellis nodded and took the telegram. "To Harriet Zimmerman, Sacramento," he read aloud. "Am safe after stage robbery. Recovering at Ingram Ranch near Silver Creek. Will contact again soon. Harriet." "That's right," Xavier confirmed. "How much?" As Ellis calculated the cost, Xavier asked casually, "Any word on what the robbers took?" "Besides the obvious money, valuables. Sheriff said they cleaned out everything. Mail, bags, luggage, even took the strong box, though it wasn't carrying much that run." Ellis squinted curiously. "Why do you ask?" "Just wondering if any of the lady's belongings might turn up," Xavier said. "She lost everything in the robbery." After paying for the telegram, Xavier made his way to the sheriff's office. A heavy-set man with a silver star pinned to his vest sat behind a scarred desk, looking up as Xavier entered. "Ingram," Sheriff Adams acknowledged with a nod. "What can I do for you?" Xavier explained about finding Harriet and her current condition. The sheriff listened intently, occasionally making notes on a pad of paper. "That's mighty fortunate for the young lady," he said when Xavier finished. "We'd about given her up for lost. I'll need to talk to her when she's able." "Of course," Xavier agreed. "But there's something else. The bandits took some important legal documents. She was carrying papers she needs for a court case in Sacramento. Any chance your posse found anything like that discarded somewhere?" The sheriff shook his head. "Nothing so far. But I'll keep an eye out and spread the word." He studied Xavier thoughtfully. "You seem mighty concerned about this young woman's affairs." Xavier felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. "Just trying to help, Sheriff. She's been through hell." "Uh-huh," Adams said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "Well, tell Miss Zimmerman I'll be out to take her statement in a few days. And Xavier, be careful getting mixed up in land disputes. They have a way of turning ugly." "I'm not mixed up in anything," Xavier protested. But the sheriff just gave him a knowing look. As Xavier left the office, he realized with some discomfort that Adams was right. He was getting involved in Harriet's problems in a way that went beyond basic hospitality. Something about her story, her determination, had drawn him in. Or perhaps, he admitted to himself as he mounted his horse for the ride home, it was simply something about her. The return journey gave Xavier plenty of time to think about his unexpected guest and the complications she had brought with her. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun was low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the yard. He was surprised to see Harriet herself sitting on the front porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the lingering heat of the day. "Miss Zimmerman," he greeted her, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Should you be up?" "Mrs. Holloway said a little fresh air would do me good," she replied. "And I was eager to hear news from town." Xavier climbed the steps and sat in the chair beside her. "I sent your telegram. Your uncle should receive it by this evening." "Thank you," Harriet said, genuine relief in her voice. "And did you hear anything about the robbery? About my papers?" Nothing specific, Xavier admitted. The sheriff has a posse looking for the gang, but they haven't found anything yet. He wants to talk to you when you're feeling stronger. Disappointment clouded her features. I see. Well, I suppose it was a long shot. The sheriff will spread the word about the missing documents, Xavier tried to reassure her. And I can ask around among the ranchers. Someone might have seen something. Harriet nodded, though she didn't look particularly hopeful. I appreciate that. After a moment, she added, I'm already imposing too much on your kindness, Mr. Ingram. Xavier, he corrected her. And you're not imposing. Truth be told, it's nice having company around here besides the ranch hands and Mrs. Holloway. Don't you have family nearby? Harriet asked, then immediately looked contrite. I'm sorry, that's too personal a question. No, it's fine, Xavier assured her. My father passed 5 years ago. Mother went before him when I was just a boy. No siblings. The ranch hands are the closest thing to family I've got these days. I understand that feeling, Harriet said softly. My mother died when I was young too. It was just my father and me until last year. Now there's only my uncle and we're not particularly close. Xavier wanted to ask why she wasn't close to her uncle, especially if he was managing her inheritance, but he held his tongue. Instead, he said, Well, you're welcome here for as long as you need. Mrs. Holloway seems pleased to have another woman around the place. Harriet smiled, the expression transforming her face despite the lingering effects of her ordeal. She's been wonderfully kind. Insisted on washing my hair this morning, though I told her I could manage. Xavier found himself noticing how the evening light caught the auburn highlights in that freshly washed hair, which fell in loose waves around her shoulders. He cleared his throat. She tends to mother everyone who crosses her path. Been that way since my father hired her when I was 10. You're fortunate to have her, Harriet observed. Good people are a blessing. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Finally, Xavier spoke again. If you're feeling up to it, I could take you to the site of the robbery day after tomorrow. Maybe seeing it will help us figure out where the bandits might have gone, or where they might have discarded items they didn't value. Harriet turned to him, eyes widening. You would do that? It's worth a try, Xavier said with a shrug. I know the area well. If the papers are out there, we stand a chance of finding them. That's extraordinarily generous, Harriet said, studying him as though trying to solve a puzzle. Why would you go to such lengths for a stranger? Xavier considered the question. Why indeed? He'd done his Christian duty by saving her life, offering shelter and medical care. No one would expect him to involve himself further in her problems. Yet here he was, proposing to help her hunt for missing documents in a dispute that had nothing to do with him. I suppose I don't like seeing injustice go unchallenged, he finally said. If this Palmer fellow is trying to steal your land through forgery, that's not right. And besides, he added with a small smile, you're not exactly a stranger anymore. Something flickered in Harriet's expression, gratitude, perhaps, or something warmer. No, she agreed softly. I suppose we're not strangers now. Mrs. Holloway's voice called from inside the house, announcing that dinner was ready. Can you make it to the table? Xavier asked, standing and offering his arm. I'll manage, Harriet said, though she accepted his support. Mrs. Holloway wrapped my feet well enough for short distances. As they made their slow way into the house, Xavier found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him, the light pressure of her hand on his arm. The subtle scent of the lavender soap Mrs. Holloway had used to wash her hair. 3 days ago, Harriet Zimmerman had been nothing more than a half-dead stranger in the desert. Now, somehow, she had become something more, though exactly what, Xavier wasn't sure. Dinner was a simple but hearty affair. beef stew, fresh bread, and preserved peaches for dessert. Mrs. Holloway had set the table in the dining room rather than the kitchen where Xavier usually ate, a clear sign that she considered Harriet a guest of significance. "This is delicious, Mrs. Holloway," Harriet praised after her first few bites. "I haven't had an appetite in days, but I find I'm quite hungry now," the housekeeper beamed. "Good sign, that is. Body knows what it needs to heal." She turned to Xavier. "Any news from town about those ruffians who attacked the stage?" Xavier relayed what little information he'd gathered, careful to mention the sheriff's intention to visit in a few days. Mrs. Holloway clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "That man has a way of upsetting folks with his questions." "You just let me know when he's coming, and I'll make sure you're strong enough to deal with him, Miss Harriet." The easy way Mrs. Holloway had taken to using Harriet's first name spoke volumes about her acceptance of their guest. The housekeeper was generally formal with strangers, maintaining a proper distance until she decided they were worthy of her friendship. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway, but I'm sure I'll be fine," Harriet said. "I want to help catch these men if I can." "Xavier mentioned taking you to the site day after tomorrow," Mrs. Holloway said, frowning slightly. "I'm not sure that's wise given your condition." "We'll take the bugboard," Xavier assured her, "and plenty of water and supplies. If Miss Zimmerman feels it's too much, we'll turn back immediately." Mrs. Holloway didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded reluctantly. "Just don't overdo it," she warned Harriet. "Those feet need time to heal properly." After dinner, Xavier excused himself to check on a calf that had been born the previous day. When he returned to the house an hour later, he found Harriet still at the table, a sheet of paper before her. "I'm trying to make a list of everything that was in my valise," she explained as he entered. "The legal documents are the most important, but there were other things, 2 letters from my father that have sentimental value, a small portrait of my parents, some jewelry that belonged to my mother." Xavier sat down across from her. "That's a good idea. If anything turns up, we'll know what to look for." "It seems silly to hope," Harriet said, setting down her pencil. "The odds of finding anything after all this time." "Hope isn't silly," Xavier countered. "Sometimes it's all we have." Harriet regarded him thoughtfully. "You're an optimist, Mr. Ingram Xavier," she corrected herself. "I wouldn't have expected that from someone living out here, where life seems so harsh." "Maybe it's because of where I live," he suggested. "You have to believe things will work out, or the loneliness and hardship would wear you down." "Is it very lonely?" Harriet asked, her voice gentle. Xavier hadn't meant to reveal so much of himself, but something about her invited confidence. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Especially in winter when the snow makes travel difficult and the days are short. But I've got my books and Mrs. Holloway and the hands for company. It's a good life, even with its challenges." "It sounds peaceful," Harriet observed. "Different from city life in San Francisco. There, you're surrounded by people but can still feel utterly alone. You didn't like living in the city. It had its attractions, museums, libraries, concerts. But I missed the open space, the connection to the land that I had growing up." She looked down at her list. "That's partly why this property means so much to me. It's not just land or money, it's my heritage, my history." Xavier nodded, understanding completely. His own ranch, built by his father's hands and sustained by his own sweat and determination, represented everything meaningful in his life. "We'll find those papers," he said with more confidence than he truly felt. "And if we don't, we'll find another way to prove your claim." Harriet looked up, surprise and something like tenderness in her expression. "We?" Xavier realized what he'd said and felt heat rise to his face. "I just meant—" "No, please," Harriet interrupted, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. I'm grateful for the sentiment, truly. It's been a long time since I felt I wasn't facing my battles alone. That simple touch and the vulnerability in her voice stirred something protective in Xavier. "You're not alone in this," he assured her. "Not anymore." The moment stretched between them, charged with an awareness that went beyond mere words. Finally, Harriet broke the spell, pulling her hand back and returning her attention to her list. "I should finish this before I forget anything important," she said, her voice a touch higher than before. Xavier took the hint and stood up. "Of course, and you should rest. Tomorrow will be a quiet day so you can build your strength, but the trip to the stage robbery site will be taxing." "I'll be ready," Harriet promised, determination hardening her delicate features. As Xavier bid her good night and headed to his own room, he found himself mulling over their conversation. Harriet Zimmerman was proving to be far more intriguing than he'd first imagined, intelligent, resilient, and possessed of a quiet strength that had nothing to do with physical power. The fact that he found her beautiful was almost secondary to these qualities, though he couldn't deny the flutter of attraction he felt whenever their eyes met. Sleep came slowly that night as Xavier's mind kept returning to the woman under his roof, and the growing certainty that her presence was changing something fundamental about his carefully ordered existence. The next day passed uneventfully, with Harriet resting as directed and Xavier attending to ranch business. By evening, she was moving more easily, though still with a noticeable limp. Mrs. Holloway had found her a suitable riding skirt and blouse for the journey planned for the following day, altering them quickly to fit Harriet's slender frame. "These belong to Mr. Ingram's mother," Harriet said when Xavier came in for supper, running her hand over the sturdy fabric. "Mrs. Holloway has been so kind to lend them to me." "They were just gathering dust," Mrs. Holloway said dismissively, though her eyes betrayed pleasure at Harriet's appreciation. "Better they get some use." Xavier felt an unexpected pang at seeing his mother's clothes worn by another woman, but it faded quickly. His mother, practical and generous, would have approved of them being put to good use. "They suit you," he said simply. The following morning dawned clear and not quite as hot as previous days, a small mercy as they prepared for their journey. Xavier had the buckboard ready by 7, loaded with water, food, and basic medical supplies. He'd added a rifle and extra ammunition as well, a precaution in case they encountered trouble. Harriet emerged from the house looking determined, her borrowed clothes neat and practical, her hair braided and pinned securely beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Mrs. Holloway had insisted she wear against the sun. "Are you sure you're up to this?" Xavier asked as he helped her into the wagon. "Absolutely," Harriet affirmed, though he noticed she winced slightly as she settled onto the seat. "My feet are much better and this is too important to delay." Mrs. Holloway fussed over them both, checking water supplies and adding an extra loaf of bread to their provisions at the last minute. "Be back before dark," she instructed Xavier. "And if Miss Harriet shows any sign of weakening, you turn around immediately." "Yes, madam," Xavier promised, smiling at her maternal concern. As they set off, Harriet waved goodbye to Mrs. Holloway, then turned her attention to the landscape unfolding before them. "It looks different from when I was wandering," she commented. "Less threatening somehow." "The desert changes with the light and your perspective," Xavier agreed. "Beautiful from a safe distance, deadly when you're in its grip." The journey to the stage route took nearly 2 hours at the buckboard's pace. Harriet remained quiet for much of it, occasionally pointing out features of the landscape she recognized from her ordeal. Xavier respected her reflective mood, understanding that revisiting the scene of such trauma couldn't be easy. Finally, They reached the main stage road, a well-worn track cutting through the arid terrain. "According to what you told me about where you walked and what the sheriff said, the attack should have happened somewhere along this stretch," Xavier explained, slowing the horses. "Do you recognize anything?" Harriet scanned the surroundings, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was a rock formation, like a giant's hand reaching up from the earth. The stage stopped just past it for the horses to rest, and that's when the bandits appeared. Xavier nodded. "Ambush Rock. That's what locals call it. It's about a mile ahead." As they approached the distinctive formation, Harriet's posture stiffened. "This is it," she said quietly. "It happened right here." Xavier halted the buckboard and helped Harriet down. The site showed evidence of the violence that had occurred, dark stains on the sandy ground that could only be blood, scattered debris partially buried by the shifting sands, wheel ruts where the stage had veered off the road. "The bodies," Harriet asked hesitantly. "Would have been taken to Silver Creek for burial," Xavier assured her. "Sheriff's men would have seen to that." Harriet nodded, relieved. The driver was hit first. He never had a chance to defend himself. The guard managed to fire once before they shot him too. Her voice was distant, as though she were seeing it happen all over again. "And you?" Xavier prompted gently. "I was ordered out of the coach at gunpoint. There were 4 of them, all masked. They took my valise, my reticule with what little money I had. One of them wanted my mother's locket." She touched her throat instinctively. "But the leader told him to leave it, said they weren't that kind of outfit." "Small mercies," Xavier murmured. "They debated what to do with me," Harriet continued, her gaze fixed on some middle distance. 2 wanted to take me with them. The leader and another man argued against it. Finally, the leader told me to start walking towards Silver Creek and not look back. He fired a shot into the air as incentive. Xavier felt a surge of anger at the casual cruelty. Left alone in the desert with no water, no protection, it was a death sentence, just a slower one than a bullet. "Did you see which way they went after the robbery?" he asked, trying to focus on the practical reason for their visit. Harriet pointed east. "They rode off in that direction, toward those hills, but I couldn't see far before I had to start walking." Xavier surveyed the area, considering. "There are some old mining camps in those hills, abandoned now, but they'd make good hiding places." He began walking in a widening circle around the ambush site. If they discarded anything they didn't want, it might still be around here. Harriet joined the search, moving carefully on her tender feet. For nearly an hour they combed the area, finding nothing but a few spent cartridge shells and a broken harness strap. "Let's try over here," Xavier suggested, pointing to a cluster of scrub brush several yards from the road. "That would be a good place to sort through their take before moving on." As they approached the brush, a glint of something metallic caught Xavier's eye. He knelt and pushed aside the brittle branches, revealing a brass clasp attached to a scrap of leather. "This might have been part of a bag or valise," he said, showing it to Harriet. Her eyes widened. "That's from my valise." The clasp was distinctive. "See how it's shaped like a small shell." Encouraged, they searched the area more thoroughly. Under a layer of wind-blown sand, Xavier found several torn papers, receipts, and letters, their edges curled and writing faded from exposure to the elements. "Harriet," he called, excitement edging his voice. "Look at these." She hurried over, dropping to her knees beside him despite her injured feet. With trembling hands, she took the papers, scanning them quickly. "These are mine," she confirmed, hope and despair warring in her voice. "But they're not the legal documents, just personal correspondence." She shuffled through them carefully. "Wait, this is my father's handwriting. It's part of a letter he wrote me last year." Xavier leaned in to look at the faded writing. "Is it something that could help your case?" "Perhaps," Harriet said thoughtfully. It mentions plans for expanding the orchard on the north section dated 2 months after Palmer claims my father sold him the property. She looked up at Xavier, a spark of renewed hope in her eyes. It's not the expert testimony or the complete documentation we had, but it does contradict Palmer's story. Keep looking, Xavier encouraged. There might be more. They spent another hour searching the area, finding more torn papers, a small lady's handkerchief with the monogram HZ, and finally, half buried beneath a rock, a leather portfolio. "This is it," Harriet exclaimed, her voice breaking with emotion as she pulled it from its hiding place. This contained all the legal documents. Xavier helped her brush off the sand and dust. The portfolio was weather-beaten and partially damaged by exposure, but when Harriet opened it, they could see papers still inside. "They're here," she breathed, leafing through them carefully. Not all of them, some pages are missing or damaged beyond reading, but the expert's analysis of the forged signature is intact, and so are 2 of my father's letters discussing future improvements to the property. She looked up at Xavier, tears shining in her eyes. This might be enough. It might actually be enough. Without thinking, Xavier pulled her into an embrace, sharing her joy. "I knew we'd find something," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Harriet stiffened momentarily in surprise, then relaxed against him, her arms going around his waist. "You believed when I'd lost hope," she murmured against his shoulder. They stayed that way for a long moment, before mutual awareness of their position caused them to pull apart, both slightly flushed. "We should keep looking," Xavier said, clearing his throat. There might be more documents scattered around. They searched until midday, finding a few more personal items but no additional legal papers. Finally, Xavier called a halt. "We should head back," he said, noting how Harriet was favoring her injured feet more heavily now. "We've got enough to make a significant start on your case, and you need to rest." Harriet didn't argue, evidence of how tired she truly was. As Xavier helped her back into the buckboard, she clutched the portfolio to her chest like a precious treasure. "I don't know how to thank you," she said as they started the journey home. "You've given me back my hope, my future." "You did most of the work yourself," Xavier pointed out. "Surviving that desert for 3 days took more courage than anything I did." "We make a good team then," Harriet said, smiling at him with a warmth that made his heart skip. "I suppose we do," he agreed, wondering when exactly this woman had come to matter so much to him. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the gentle sway of the buckboard lulling Harriet into a light doze. Xavier found his gaze drawn repeatedly to her face, relaxed now in sleep, the worry lines smoothed away. She was lovely, yes, but it was more than physical beauty that attracted him. Her determination, her intelligence, her resilience in the face of adversity, these were qualities he admired deeply. When they arrived back at the ranch, Mrs. Holloway was waiting anxiously on the porch. "You're later than I expected," she scolded as Xavier helped a now awake Harriet down from the wagon. "We found them, Mrs. Holloway," Harriet said, holding up the portfolio. "The documents I need for my case." The housekeeper's expression softened immediately. "Well, praise be for that. Come inside and tell me all about it while I fix you both something to eat. You look done in, Miss Harriet." Over a late lunch, they recounted their discovery. Mrs. Holloway listened attentively, beaming with almost maternal pride at their success. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she declared when they finished. "Bringing you to our doorstep, Miss Harriet, leading Xavier to find those papers, it's all part of a greater plan." Xavier wasn't sure about divine intervention, but he had to admit the circumstances were remarkable. What were the odds that he would find Harriet in that vast desert? that they would locate the discarded documents when the bandits could have taken them anywhere. "Now you need to rest those feet," Mrs. Holloway instructed Harriet. "I'll bring some fresh bandages and salve to your room." "Thank you, but I should start organizing these papers," Harriet protested, though her exhaustion was evident. "And I need to send another telegram to my uncle, let him know what we found." "The papers will wait a few hours, and Xavier can ride into town tomorrow for the telegram," Mrs. Holloway said firmly. "Right now, you need to elevate those feet before they swell any worse." Recognizing the futility of arguing with the housekeeper, Harriet acquiesced. As Mrs. Holloway led her toward her room, she glanced back at Xavier with a smile that warmed him to his core. Left alone, Xavier found himself contemplating the changes of the past week. His orderly, predictable life had been disrupted by Harriet's arrival, yet he couldn't bring himself to regret a moment of it. There was a vibrancy to his days now, a sense of purpose beyond the routine of ranch work. But what would happen when Harriet was well enough to travel to Sacramento? When her legal battle was resolved? These questions nagged at him as he went about his afternoon chores, checking the herd in the north pasture and discussing fence repairs with Samuel. That evening, Harriet joined them for dinner, looking refreshed after her rest. She'd spent the afternoon carefully examining and organizing the recovered documents, and her spirits were high. "There's enough here to cast serious doubt on Palmer's claim," she explained excitedly. "The expert's analysis clearly shows the signature on the bill of sale doesn't match my father's handwriting in these authenticated letters. And the dates on these documents prove my father was still making plans for the property long after he supposedly sold it." "Sounds like you've got a solid case," Xavier said, pleased to see her so animated. "Thanks to you," Harriet emphasized. "I never would have found these without your help." "What will you do after the case is settled?" Mrs. Holloway asked, bringing a dish of peach cobbler to the table. "Return to San Francisco." The question hung in the air, weighted with implications Xavier wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I haven't decided," Harriet admitted. "San Francisco never truly felt like home. I was only there for school, and now that's finished." She hesitated, then added, "Part of me wants to stay on my father's land, to honor his legacy by continuing what he built. But it's a large property for a woman alone to manage. Plenty of women run farms and businesses these days," Xavier pointed out. "Especially out west, where conventional rules don't always apply." "True," Harriet agreed, "but it would be a challenge." "One I suspect you're more than equal to," Xavier said with conviction. A flush of pleasure colored Harriet's cheeks at his confidence in her. "Perhaps. But first I have to win the case." "You will," Xavier assured her, "and whatever you decide to do after, you'll succeed at that too." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them: mutual respect, growing affection, and possibilities neither was quite ready to articulate. Mrs. Holloway, observing this exchange with knowing eyes, cleared her throat. "Who's ready for cobbler?" The moment broken, they turned their attention to dessert, though Xavier found his thoughts continually drifting to Harriet throughout the remainder of the evening. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky, Harriet broached a subject that had clearly been on her mind. "Sheriff Adams will be coming tomorrow, you said," Xavier nodded. "Likely in the afternoon. He'll want your account of the robbery and to see the documents we found." "Do you think there's any chance of catching the men who did this?" Harriet asked quietly. "Honestly, it's unlikely after this much time has passed. They could be anywhere by now." Seeing her disappointed expression, he added, "But the sheriff is tenacious, and stage robbers tend to strike again. Eventually, they'll make a mistake." Harriet shivered slightly despite the warm evening. I keep seeing their faces in my mind, or rather, the masks they wore. Wondering if I'll pass one of them on the street someday and never know it was him. Xavier moved his chair closer to hers, instinctively wanting to provide comfort. That's a natural fear after what you've been through, but you're safe now. I know, she said, offering him a small smile. I feel safe with you. The simple statement touched him deeply. Good, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. They sat in silence for a while, the rhythmic chirping of crickets the only sound. Finally, Harriet spoke again. Xavier, there's something I need to tell you about my uncle. The seriousness of her tone caught his attention. What about him? Harriet hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. He's not what he appears to be. When my father died, he stepped in to manage the estate, presenting himself as concerned only for my welfare. But I've had doubts about his motivations for some time. What kind of doubts? Xavier prompted when she paused. Small things at first, delays in sending me the allowance my father's will specified, excuses about why certain documents couldn't be forwarded to me in San Francisco. Then I began receiving reports from neighbors near our property that portions of the land were being logged, though my father had always preserved the wooded areas. You think your uncle was profiting from the timber? Xavier guessed. Harriet nodded. I confronted him about it in letters, but he dismissed my concerns, saying limited logging was necessary for the farm's financial stability. When I pressed the issue, he suggested I was too young and inexperienced to understand estate management. Xavier frowned. How old are you, if you don't mind my asking? 22, Harriet replied. Old enough to know when I'm being deceived. And this Palmer, the man claiming your father sold him the land, do you think there's a connection to your uncle? Harriet's expression grew troubled. I've wondered the same thing. It seems too coincidental that this claim would emerge right as I was finishing school and preparing to take control of the estate myself. You think your uncle might be behind the forged sale document? Xavier asked, the implications dawning on him. I have no proof, Harriet said quickly. But yes, I've considered the possibility. That's why I didn't want you to mention the stolen documents in the telegram. If he is involved with Palmer, I don't want him to know we've recovered evidence that could expose the forgery. Xavier leaned back in his chair, absorbing this new information. That explains why you're so determined to handle this yourself, rather than relying on your uncle's help. Exactly, Harriet confirmed. I need to present these documents to the court myself, to ensure they're not lost or altered before the hearing. When do you need to be in Sacramento? Xavier asked. The hearing is in 12 days, Harriet said. I should arrive a few days earlier to consult with a lawyer and prepare. Xavier did some quick mental calculations. The stage from Silver Creek to Sacramento runs twice weekly. There's one leaving day after tomorrow that would get you there in plenty of time. He tried to keep his voice neutral, but something of his reluctance to see her go must have shown through, because Harriet reached over and placed her hand on his arm. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done, she said softly. I would have died in that desert if not for you, and now you've helped me find the means to protect my inheritance. I wish there was some way to repay such kindness. No repayment necessary, Xavier said gruffly, acutely aware of her hand still resting on his arm. Anyone would have done the same. We both know that's not true, Harriet said, withdrawing her hand slowly. What you've done since goes far beyond ordinary kindness. Xavier didn't know how to respond. The thought of Harriet leaving in 2 days created a hollow feeling in his chest that he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Instead, he changed the subject. We should turn in. Tomorrow we'll be busy with the sheriff's visit and preparations for your journey. Harriet seemed to sense his discomfort and didn't press the issue. You're right, of course. Good night, Xavier, and thank you again for everything. As she rose and went inside, Xavier remained on the porch, his thoughts in turmoil. In just a week, Harriet Zimmerman had become important to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The prospect of her departure left him feeling adrift, unsure of what he wanted or how to proceed. One thing was certain, though he wasn't ready to say goodbye, not yet. And as he finally headed to his own bed, a plan began forming in his mind. Sheriff Adams arrived the following afternoon as expected, his deputy in tow. Harriet recounted the robbery in detail, describing the bandits and the direction they had fled. She showed him the recovered documents, explaining their significance to her legal case. "You're lucky to be alive, Miss Zimmerman," the sheriff said when she had finished, "and fortunate that Ingram here found you when he did." "Believe me, I'm well aware of that," Harriet replied, glancing at Xavier with unmistakable warmth. The sheriff noticed the look and cleared his throat. "Well, I'll put out word about these bandits, though as Ingram probably told you, chances of catching them now are slim. At least you recovered your papers." After the sheriff and his deputy departed, Xavier found Harriet in the sitting room, carefully repacking the portfolio with her precious documents. "I've been thinking," he said, steeling himself for what he was about to propose, "about your trip to Sacramento." Harriet looked up, her expression curious. "Yes, the stage isn't the safest way to travel, especially after what happened, and you're still recovering from your ordeal." He took a deep breath. "I'd like to take you to Sacramento myself." Surprise registered on Harriet's face. "You would do that? But it's a considerable journey, and you have the ranch to consider." "Samuel can manage things here for a couple of weeks," Xavier said, "and this way I can ensure you arrive safely and have support during your court case." "That's very generous," Harriet said, studying him intently. "But may I ask why? You've already done so much." Xavier hesitated, unused to expressing his feelings so directly. "Because I care what happens to you," he finally said, "and because I'm not ready to say goodbye yet." The admission hung between them, more revealing than he had intended. Harriet's eyes widened slightly, a flush rising to her cheeks. "I'm not ready either," she confessed softly. Relief and something deeper washed through Xavier. "Then it's settled. We'll leave the day after tomorrow. Take it slow so you can continue healing. We should reach Sacramento with plenty of time before your hearing." Harriet nodded, a smile lighting her face. "I'd be honored to have you accompany me, and grateful for the company." When Xavier informed Mrs. Holloway of the plan, the housekeeper gave him a knowing look, but limited her comments to practical matters, what supplies they would need, which route would be best given Harriet's condition, how Samuel should handle various ranch operations in Xavier's absence. The next day passed in a flurry of preparations. Xavier checked and rechecked the buckboard, ensuring it was in perfect condition for the journey. He plotted their route carefully, planning to stay at established way stations where possible to provide Harriet with proper rest. Harriet, meanwhile, seemed to have blossomed with the recovery of her documents and the prospect of resolving her legal troubles. Her strength returned visibly, and though she still walked with a slight limp, her spirits were high. She insisted on helping Mrs. Holloway with meals and household tasks, eager to contribute rather than remain an invalid. The evening before their departure, after dinner had been cleared away, Xavier found himself alone with Harriet on the porch once more. The setting sun painted the desert in hues of gold and pink, the beauty of it striking even to Xavier, who had seen thousands of such sunsets. "I'll miss this view," Harriet said softly, echoing his thoughts. "There's nothing quite like a desert sunset." "No," Xavier agreed. "Though the Sierras have their own kind of beauty, you'll see as we travel through them." "Have you been to Sacramento often?" Harriet asked. "A few times a year, to sell cattle and buy supplies we can't get in Silver Creek." Xavier leaned against the porch railing facing her. "It's growing fast, new buildings going up everywhere, more people arriving daily." "Progress," Harriet murmured. "Though sometimes I wonder if all change is for the better." "Depends on the change, I suppose," Xavier said. "Some things are worth preserving as they are." Their eyes met, and Xavier knew they were no longer speaking of cities or landscapes, but something more personal, more immediate. The connection between them had deepened so rapidly, it sometimes left him breathless. "Xavier," Harriet began, then hesitated. "I want you to know how much these days here have meant to me. Not just because you saved my life or helped me find my documents, but because—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because you've shown me what kind of man you are. Honorable, kind, steady in your convictions. Those are rare qualities." Xavier felt both humbled and elevated by her assessment. "You've shown me something too," he said, moving to sit beside her. "Your courage, your determination, they are remarkable, Harriet. When I found you in that desert, half dead from thirst and exposure, I admired your will to survive. But getting to know you these past days, I've come to admire so much more." Harriet's eyes shone in the fading light. "When this is over after the hearing, I'd like to—" She stopped, then started again. "I hope we might." Xavier took her hand, his heart pounding. "So do I," he said simply. They sat like that, hands clasped, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. No further words were needed, the understanding between them was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The journey to Sacramento began at dawn the next morning. Mrs. Holloway had packed the buckboard with enough provisions to last them well beyond the expected travel time, clearly anticipating any possible delay or emergency. "You take care of each other," she instructed as she hugged Harriet goodbye. "And write when you get there so I know you arrived safe." "We will," Harriet promised, returning the embrace warmly. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Holloway." To Xavier's surprise, the housekeeper embraced him as well. "Don't let this one get away," she whispered fiercely in his ear. "She's special." "I know," he whispered back, earning a satisfied nod from Mrs. Holloway. The first day's travel went smoothly. Xavier had chosen a route that followed established trails as much as possible, making the journey easier on Harriet's still healing feet. They stopped frequently for rest and refreshment, Xavier insisting that Harriet not overtax herself. As they traveled, they talked more freely than ever before, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their views on everything from politics to literature. Xavier found himself revealing thoughts and feelings he'd never articulated to anyone, drawn out by Harriet's genuine interest and thoughtful responses. "I never imagined I could feel so comfortable with someone I've known for such a short time," Harriet confessed as they made camp the first evening. "It's as though we've known each other for years." "I feel the same," Xavier agreed, building a small fire to ward off the evening chill. "Maybe some connections don't need time to develop, they just are." "My father used to say that about my mother," Harriet said, smiling at the memory. "He claimed he knew the moment he saw her that she was the one he would marry. I always thought it was a romantic exaggeration, but now—" She glanced at Xavier, then away, a blush coloring her cheeks. Xavier's heart quickened at the implication. "And now?" he prompted gently. Harriet met his gaze, her expression open and vulnerable. "Now I wonder if perhaps he was simply stating a truth I hadn't yet experienced for myself." The admission hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Xavier moved to sit beside her on the blanket she'd spread near the fire. "Harriet," he began, taking her hand in his, I know we've known each other only a short time, but I can't ignore what's happening between us. When I found you in that desert, I had no idea you would come to mean so much to me so quickly. Nor I you, Harriet said softly. It's unexpected but undeniable. Xavier brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. When this is over, after your court case is resolved, I'd like to court you properly, if you'll allow it. Harriet's smile was radiant in the firelight. I would like that very much. They sat together in companionable silence as night fell fully, the stars emerging in breathtaking profusion overhead. Later, as they retired to their separate bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Xavier found himself filled with a contentment he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. The journey continued over the next several days, each mile bringing them closer to Sacramento and to each other. They faced minor challenges: a wheel that needed repair, a brief summer storm that forced them to seek shelter, but nothing they couldn't overcome together. On the fourth day, they reached the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the landscape changing from desert to increasingly verdant terrain. Harriet delighted in the transformation, exclaiming over wildflowers and streams they encountered. It's like watching the world come alive, she said as they stopped to rest by a clear mountain brook. From the stark beauty of the desert to all this green abundance. Xavier watched her dip her hands in the cool water, struck anew by her own vibrant beauty. It suits you, he observed. This landscape, I mean, you seem at home here. Harriet looked up, her expression thoughtful. I could be, she said simply. The implication wasn't lost on Xavier. His ranch lay in desert country, but not far from these transitional lands. A woman could make a home there, raise a family, build a life. As they continued through the mountains, the conversation turned to more practical matters: the upcoming court hearing and how best to present the evidence they had recovered. Palmer will have lawyers, Harriet said with a frown. Expensive ones, I imagine. I'll need to find representation quickly when we reach Sacramento. I know a man there, Xavier offered, James Whitfield, honest attorney who's handled some legal matters for me in the past. I can introduce you. That would be wonderful, Harriet said gratefully. Having trusted counsel will make all the difference. On the sixth day of their journey, they reached the outskirts of Sacramento. The city had grown significantly since Xavier's last visit, sprawling outward from the riverside with new construction visible in all directions. We should find lodging first, Xavier suggested as they entered the bustling streets. Then locate your uncle to let him know you're safe. Harriet nodded, though Xavier noticed a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. Yes, but I think it best if we don't reveal everything immediately. If my suspicions about his involvement with Palmer are correct, we need to be cautious. Xavier agreed, and they proceeded to a respectable hotel where he secured 2 rooms. After refreshing themselves from the journey, they set out for the address Harriet had for her uncle's residence. Harold Zimmerman's home was an impressive 2-story structure in one of Sacramento's more prosperous neighborhoods. As they approached the front door, Xavier could feel Harriet's nervousness in the tight grip she maintained on his arm. It will be all right, he assured her quietly. I'm right here with you. The door was opened by a stern-faced housekeeper who regarded them with suspicion until Harriet identified herself. The woman's expression shifted to shock. Miss Zimmerman, we thought you were dead. Mr. Zimmerman received word of the stage robbery and that there were no survivors. As you can see, that report was somewhat exaggerated, Harriet said with a touch of dry humor. Is my uncle at home, in his study? I'll announce you at once. They were shown to a formal parlor to wait. Minutes later, a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s hurried into the room, disbelief written across his features. Harriet, my God, it is you. Harold Zimmerman exclaimed, embracing his niece stiffly. "We were told everyone perished in that dreadful attack. How did you survive?" Harriet extricated herself from her uncle's embrace, maintaining a composed demeanor. "It's a long story, Uncle. I was fortunate enough to be found by Mr. Ingram here after wandering in the desert for 3 days." She gestured to Xavier, who nodded politely. "He saved my life and has been kind enough to escort me to Sacramento." Harold turned to Xavier, extending his hand. "I'm deeply in your debt, sir. My niece is my only family. To have lost her would have been—" He trailed off, apparently overcome with emotion. Xavier shook the offered hand, studying the older man carefully. There was something calculated in his display of feeling, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Anyone would have done the same, Mr. Zimmerman." "Nonsense. Such extraordinary kindness must be rewarded." "You must stay here as my guest, of course. I insist." "Thank you, but we've already secured accommodations," Xavier declined smoothly. "We—" Harold's gaze sharpened as it moved between Xavier and Harriet. "You're traveling together unchaperoned." "Mr. Ingram has been a perfect gentleman," Harriet said firmly, "and given the circumstances, conventional proprieties seemed less important than my safety and well-being." Harold frowned but evidently decided not to pursue the matter. "Well, you're home now, my dear. You'll stay here, of course, and recover from your ordeal." Harriet glanced at Xavier before responding. "Actually, Uncle, I prefer to maintain my current arrangements for now. I have business to attend to in preparation for the hearing regarding the Palmer claim." "The hearing?" Harold's expression flickered briefly surprise, alarm, before settling into concern. "My dear, after what you've been through, surely that can wait. Your health must be your priority." "I'm quite recovered, thank you," Harriet said, "and the hearing is in less than a week." "I intend to be fully prepared." "But all your documentation was lost in the robbery," Harold protested. "Without it, I fear your case is weak at best." "Actually," Harriet said carefully, watching her uncle's face, "not everything was lost. Mr. Ingram helped me recover some items the bandits had discarded." Harold's face paled visibly. "Recovered? What exactly did you recover?" "Some personal items," Harriet said vaguely. "Letters, papers. Nothing of monetary value, of course, but sentimental to me." Xavier noted how deliberately she avoided mentioning the specific legal documents. Harold seemed both relieved and suspicious, his gaze calculating as it moved between them. "Well, that's fortunate," he finally said. "Still, I wish you would reconsider staying here. It's hardly appropriate for a young lady of your standing to remain in a hotel, especially after such a traumatic experience." "I appreciate your concern, Uncle, but my mind is made up." Harriet rose, signaling an end to the discussion. "I'll call on you again tomorrow, perhaps for tea." Harold clearly wasn't pleased but nodded his agreement. "Of course. 3 o'clock. Perfect," Harriet said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As they departed, Xavier could feel the older man's gaze boring into his back. Once they were a safe distance from the house, he spoke quietly. "Your uncle didn't seem as overjoyed to see you alive as one might expect." "No," Harriet agreed grimly. "And did you notice his reaction when I mentioned recovering items from the robbery? He was frightened, Xavier. He wanted to know exactly what we found." "He's involved," Xavier concluded. "The question is, how deeply? Is he working with Palmer, or is he Palmer himself?" "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Has anyone besides your uncle ever met this Victor Palmer? Is there proof he exists as a separate individual?" Harriet stopped walking, her expression stunned. "You think my uncle might have created a fictitious buyer to acquire my property legally? That's diabolical." "But effective," Xavier pointed out. "If the court rules in Palmer's favor, your uncle as Palmer gets the property, and you have no recourse." It would explain why he was so alarmed at the idea you might have recovered evidence. Harriet's face hardened with determination. We need to see your attorney friend immediately. If my uncle is behind this, we need to expose him before the hearing. They located James Whitfield's office near the courthouse. The attorney, a sharp-featured man in his 40s with keen eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, listened attentively as they explained the situation. "Fascinating case," he said when they had finished. "And these recovered documents, you say they include expert analysis of the forged signature?" "Yes," Harriet confirmed, opening the portfolio she'd kept close since their discovery. "It's damaged but legible. The expert clearly states that the signature on the bill of sale is not consistent with my father's authenticated handwriting." Whitfield examined the papers carefully. "This is certainly compelling evidence." "And these letters from your father, dated after the supposed sale, discussing future plans for the property, they directly contradict the claim that he sold the land." "Is it enough?" Xavier asked. Whitfield removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "It's strong, but not ironclad. What would make the case truly solid would be proof that Palmer doesn't exist, or that he's actually your uncle in disguise." "How would we obtain such proof?" Harriet asked. "I have contacts private investigators who could look into the matter discreetly. If Palmer is a fiction, there will be traces of the deception. No one creates a completely false identity without leaving some trail." "We have less than a week before the hearing," Xavier reminded him. "Then we'd best get started immediately," Whitfield said, replacing his spectacles. "I'll put my best man on it today." Over the next several days, Harriet met with Whitfield regularly to prepare for the hearing. Xavier accompanied her to these meetings, offering support and occasional insights based on his own dealings with property law. Harriet also maintained appearances with her uncle, visiting him for tea as promised, and deflecting his increasingly pointed questions about exactly what she had recovered from the robbery site. She played her role perfectly, appearing grateful for his concern while revealing nothing of her suspicions or the investigation into Palmer's identity. 3 days before the hearing, Whitfield summoned them to his office, his expression triumphant. "We found it," he announced as soon as they were seated. "The smoking gun, as it were." "What exactly?" Harriet asked eagerly. "My investigator traced the notary who supposedly witnessed the bill of sale between your father and Palmer. The man admits he never saw your father sign the document. He was paid by your uncle to backdate and notarize the paper. He's willing to testify to this in court." Xavier squeezed Harriet's hand as she absorbed this news. "That's it then. Proof of fraud." "Indeed," Whitfield agreed. "With this testimony, plus your recovered documents, the case against Palmer, or rather, against your uncle, becomes overwhelmingly strong." "Will criminal charges be brought against my uncle?" Harriet asked quietly. "Most likely," Whitfield confirmed. "Forgery and attempted fraud at minimum. Possibly more serious charges if we can prove he was connected to the stage robbery." "The robbery?" Xavier questioned. "You think he arranged that too? It's suspicious timing, isn't it?" Whitfield pointed out. "The robbery occurred just as Miss Zimmerman was transporting evidence that could expose his scheme, and only she survived to tell the tale." "My God," Harriet whispered, the color draining from her face. "You think he meant for me to die out there? His own niece?" "It's speculation at this point," Whitfield cautioned, "but worth investigating further, especially if the bandits are eventually caught." Xavier felt a cold anger taking root at the thought that Harriet Zimmerman might have orchestrated not just the fraud but the deadly attack that had nearly claimed Harriet's life. If true, the man deserved the harshest punishment the law could provide. "What happens now?" Harriet asked, her voice steady despite the shock of these revelations. "We continue as planned," Whitfield advised. "Present our case at the hearing, including the notary's testimony. Your uncle won't know we've discovered his deception until it's too late." "And after," Harriet pressed. "If the fraud is proven and the case dismissed, what happens to the property?" "It remains yours as your father intended," Whitfield assured her. "You'll have full legal control over it." As they left the attorney's office, Xavier could see Harriet struggling with the implications of what they'd learned. He guided her to a small park nearby, finding a secluded bench where they could talk privately. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "I suspected my uncle was dishonest," Harriet said, her voice low. "But to think he might have arranged for me to be killed, I can't quite believe it even now." Xavier took her hand, holding it firmly between both of his. "Whatever the truth turns out to be, you're not alone in this. Remember that." Harriet looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Xavier. From the moment you found me in that desert, you've been my strength, my support through all of this." "You're stronger than you know," Xavier said, lifting one hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I've just been privileged to witness that strength." Harriet leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "When this is over," she said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze directly, "I want to start a new chapter. One where decisions are made based on what I want, not what I'm running from or fighting against." "And what do you want, Harriet?" Xavier asked, his heart pounding. Her answer was to lean forward and press her lips to his, a gentle, questioning kiss that nonetheless sent warmth flooding through his entire body. He responded in kind, one hand cradling her cheek as the kiss deepened, becoming an affirmation, a promise. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Harriet smiled. "That," she said simply, "among other things." Xavier returned her smile, feeling as though a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted. "I want that too," he admitted. "Have since almost the moment you woke up in my house and looked at me with those remarkable eyes of yours." A blush colored Harriet's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Then I suppose we have something to look forward to once this ordeal is behind us." "Indeed we do," Xavier agreed, rising and offering his hand to help her up. "But first, let's win your case." The day of the hearing arrived clear and warm. Harriet, dressed in a navy blue dress Mrs. Holloway had helped alter for her, appeared calm and collected, though Xavier could sense her underlying tension as they entered the courthouse. Harold Zimmerman was already there, accompanied by a distinguished-looking attorney. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Harriet and Xavier entering together, but he offered a tight smile and nod of greeting. "Any sign of Palmer?" Xavier murmured as they took their seats beside Whitfield. "No, and I don't expect we'll see him today," Whitfield replied quietly. "Since he doesn't actually exist." The hearing began with the judge, a stern-faced older man named Townsend, reviewing the basic facts of the case. Palmer's attorney presented the bill of sale, arguing that Jonathan Zimmerman had legally transferred ownership of the property to his client before his death. When it came time for Harriet's side to present their case, Whitfield was masterful. He first introduced the recovered documents, the expert's analysis of the forged signature, and Jonathan Zimmerman's letters discussing future plans for the property dated after the supposed sale. Harold Zimmerman's face grew increasingly pale as the evidence mounted. When Whitfield called the notary as a surprise witness, he seemed to shrink in his seat, his expression one of dawning horror. The notary's testimony was damning. He described in detail how Harold Zimmerman had paid him to falsely notarize the bill of sale, and how he had never seen Jonathan Zimmerman sign the document. "Mr. Zimmerman told me it was just a formality," the notary explained nervously. A family matter to protect his niece's inheritance. I knew it was wrong, but the money he offered. He trailed off, ashamed. And where is this Victor Palmer today? Judge Townsend asked Palmer's attorney. Why is he not present to defend his claim? The attorney, visibly flustered, stammered about his client being unavoidably detained. The judge's expression made clear his skepticism. Your Honor, Whitfield interjected, we submit that Victor Palmer does not appear today because he does not, in fact, exist, except as a fabrication created by Harriet Zimmerman to fraudulently obtain control of property rightfully belonging to my client. Harold surged to his feet. This is outrageous. I demand, sit down, Mr. Zimmerman, the judge ordered sharply. You'll have your chance to respond to these allegations. But when that chance came, Harold's denials rang hollow against the weight of evidence presented. Judge Townsend was not impressed. I've heard enough, he declared after both sides had presented their arguments. Based on the evidence before me, I find the purported sale of the Zimmerman property to Victor Palmer to be fraudulent and therefore null and void. The property remains, as Jonathan Zimmerman intended, in the ownership of his daughter, Harriet Zimmerman. Relief washed over Harriet as she gripped Xavier's hand tightly. The judge continued, his tone severe. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation of criminal charges against Harriet Zimmerman for forgery and fraud. Bailiff, please take Mr. Zimmerman into custody. As Harold was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, he stopped beside Harriet. You'll regret this, he hissed. That property should have been mine. Your father promised, my father promised you nothing, Harriet interrupted, her voice steady. He trusted you to protect my interests, and instead you betrayed that trust. I regret only that I didn't see your true nature sooner. Harold was escorted from the courtroom, still protesting his innocence. Harriet turned to Xavier and Whitfield, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering sadness. It's over, she said softly. Finally over. Justice prevailed, Whitfield said, gathering his papers. Your father would be proud of how you fought for his legacy, Miss Zimmerman. Outside the courthouse, Harriet took a deep breath of the fresh air, as though cleansing herself of the tension and uncertainty of the past weeks. What will you do now? Xavier asked as they walked toward their hotel. First, I'll need to visit the property, assess its condition after my uncle's management, Harriet said thoughtfully. Then make decisions about its future operation. And after that, Xavier prompted, his heart rate quickening. Harriet stopped walking and turned to face him fully. After that, I was hoping you might show me more of your ranch. I've only seen a small part of it after all, and under rather unusual circumstances. You want to come back with me, Xavier clarified, hope rising in his chest. If the invitation is still open, Harriet said, a hint of vulnerability in her expression. Xavier took both her hands in his. Harriet, nothing would make me happier. These past weeks, getting to know you. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Nor I you, Harriet admitted, her cheeks flushing. It's all happened so quickly, but it feels more real than anything I've experienced. When I found you in that desert, Xavier said, his voice roughening with emotion, I was just trying to save a life. I had no idea I was finding the woman who would capture my heart. Harriet's eyes shimmered with tears. And I was just trying to survive another hour, another day. I never imagined I'd find someone who would make me want to build a future, not just endure the present. Xavier drew her closer, uncaring of who might see them on the busy street. I love you, Harriet Zimmerman. I think I have since you first opened your eyes in my home and fought for that extra sip of water. Harriet laughed softly, even as a tear slipped down her cheek. I love you too, Xavier Ingram, my desert savior, my champion, my heart." Their kiss sealed these declarations, a promise of the future they would build together. 2 weeks later, after Harriet had addressed the most pressing matters regarding her inherited property, they returned to Xavier's ranch. Mrs. Holloway welcomed them with open arms and knowing eyes, clearly unsurprised when Xavier announced their engagement the very next day. "About time," was all she said. Though her fierce hug spoke volumes more over the following months, Xavier and Harriet created a new life together. Harriet hired a capable manager for her father's property, allowing her to divide her time between Sacramento and the ranch. With her business acumen and Xavier's knowledge of cattle ranching, both properties flourished. They were married that autumn in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Mrs. Holloway, Samuel, and a few close friends in attendance. As they spoke their vows beneath the vast desert sky, Xavier found himself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. "What are you thinking?" Harriet asked later, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching yet another spectacular sunset. "About how finding you in that desert was the luckiest day of my life," Xavier admitted, drawing her close. "How giving you my last water was the best decision I ever made." "I thought I was dying that day," Harriet said softly. "Instead, I was just beginning to live." Years passed, bringing changes and growth. Their family expanded with the birth of a son, Jonathan, named after Harriet's father, and later, a daughter they called Elizabeth, after Xavier's mother. The ranch prospered, as did Harriet's inherited property, which they eventually converted partly to orchards, fulfilling her father's vision. Harold Zimmerman served 5 years in prison for his crimes before being released. He left California, reportedly for the East Coast, and never contacted Harriet again. The bandits who had robbed the stage were eventually captured after another, similar attack. Under questioning, they revealed that Harold had indeed hired them, though they claimed he had only instructed them to take Harriet's documents, not to harm her. Whether this was truth or an attempt to avoid more serious charges remained uncertain. Through all life's challenges and joys, Xavier and Harriet's bond only deepened. Often, on summer evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the desert transform in the fading light, and marvel at how a moment of desperate need had led to a lifetime of love. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked once, many years into their marriage. "Staying here instead of returning to city life?" Harriet's answer was immediate and certain. "Never. This place, this life with you, it's everything I never knew I wanted until I found it." She squeezed his hand, her fingers still fitting perfectly between his own. "Or until it found me lost in the desert with no hope left." "We found each other," Xavier corrected gently, "and I thank God every day that we did." As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, they sat in contented silence, their love as vast and enduring as the desert that had first brought them together.